everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Daniel Horan, and I am professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology here at St. Mary's, and I have the distinct privilege of serving as the director of the Center for Spirituality. And I am so delighted to welcome you to this, our last Ex Libris author lecture series event of this semester, more to come in the spring. But with all due respect to our previous presenters this semester, I guess the expression is save the best for last. So actually, they're all pretty great. So let me say just a little bit about the Center for Spirituality. Founded in 1984 with the generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, and shout out to our sisters who are joining us in person, and I know many who are joining us remotely. The Center for Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. A hub for scholarly and public engagement, we draw on intellectual resources in the Catholic and Christian heritage, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before we proceed with our exciting event this afternoon, we wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land and to honor the native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many, many generations, and who continue to do so today. It's with deep gratitude that we recognize our native siblings and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. Just a note about the format of our program in this Ex Libris series. As with the previous two events that we've had, those wonderful events this semester, the program is the same. First, Mr. Robert Ellsberg is going to offer a brief presentation about his work. Next, he and I are going to engage in a conversation about his book, the themes in his book. And finally, we will open the floor for questions and comments from both the in-person crowd here and those who are joining us virtually through Zoom, through the webinar. So if you're joining us virtually through Zoom, we have our fearless student worker, Miss Rebecca Holm, who is operating Ground Central up there. Feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A or into the chat, and we'd be delighted to hear from you. Just a reminder as well that the campus bookstore has copies of this book available for sale in the lobby, and Mr. Ellsberg will be around afterwards to meet you and gladly sign copies of his book. And now it's my privilege to introduce our guest today. Robert Ellsberg is the editor-in-chief and publisher of Orbis Books, where he has worked for the past 35 years. Robert interrupted his college studies in 1975 to work with Dorothy Day at the Catholic Worker in New York City, where he eventually remained for 5 years, serving for 2 years as the managing editor of the Catholic Worker newspaper. After Dorothy Day's death in 1980, Robert edited her selected writings. And since then, he has edited 4 more volumes of Dorothy Day's writings, including her diaries and selected letters. On behalf of the Archdiocese of New York, he was appointed to the commission to prepare her cause for canonization, which is underway right now. Robert's interests in saints has extended to a series of books that have done much to enlarge the understanding of saints and holiness over the years. His books include All Saints, Daily Reflections on the Saints, Prophets and Witnesses in Our Time, The Saint's Guide to Happiness, and one of his more recent, A Living Gospel, Reading God's Story in Holy Lives. For over 10 years, he has contributed daily reflections on saints and holy figures for liturgical presses Give Us This Day. I know many of us here are subscribers to that. And I hope it's not a spoiler alert to say that next summer in July, the date escapes me right now, there is one of the days of the Saints' reflections will be on a certain Sister Madaleva Wolf. So if you're not a subscriber, subscribe soon. Many of these reflections have been collected in Blessed Among Us. His latest book, about which he's here to speak this evening, is called Dearest Sister Wendy, A Surprising Story of Faith and Friendship. And I should also like to add that I've had the privilege of knowing Robert and working with him now for many years. And I am personally honored to be able to call him a friend and a colleague. And so with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Robert Ellsberg here to St. Mary's College, and I invite you to join me in extending a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Dan, and all of you who've come this evening, and those who are watching from the comfort of their homes, wherever that may be. This is exciting for me. This is actually the first time I've ever spoken about this book, and it's a little difficult to know even what that means. As you'll see, I'm just the co-author of this book. Sister Wendy Beckett has is listed first as the author, co-author. It's really our book, but as I was saying to Father Dan, I don't feel that I'm necessarily the best interpreter of this book or of its contents. I've read it, not just the editing of it, I've read it many, many times. I read it again in the last 2 days, cover to cover. And every time I do, I see something new in it. I discover something new. So I don't feel that I'm necessarily the expert in representing what Sister Wendy was all about, what her message was. I think I'll be reflecting on that for as long as I live. But I'm very glad at this opportunity to share the story of the book. First of all, how many people here have any knowledge of who Sister Wendy Beckett was? Some of the youngers probably not, because her celebrity came in the 1990s when she was discovered by the BBC and given her own television program to travel around the world to museums and talk about art. And it was picked up here by PBS. And like many people, that's how I first got to know her, as this sort of art nun. She wore this medieval looking habit of her own sort of design. The important thing to know about Sister Wendy was that she was born in 1930 and entered the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, a teaching order in South Africa, when she was 16, and spent then decades as a nun teaching, which was not really her heart's desire or her real vocation. She always felt that she was called to be a contemplative and to live a life of complete dedication to prayer and meditation on the presence of God. And she finally got permission to leave her order and became a consecrated virgin and hermit, living on the grounds of a Carmelite monastery in England. That was 1970. Probably some of you are familiar with a figure like Julian of Norwich, who lived not too far away, but in a different century, in the 14th century, back in the age of anchoresses, who would be sealed up in a cell attached to a church wall and really, be sort of dead to the world and live this, total life of seclusion and contemplation. That was really her idea of the perfect life. Except she had it called she felt even more total seclusion. She said Julian of Norwich had a window out onto the street where people could come and talk to her and ask spiritual questions. I wouldn't want to do that. Julian might have had a cat. I would not want to have a cat. I couldn't possibly share my solitude with anybody, so focused on God. Now, the comical aspect of all of that is that she becomes this international globe-trotting celebrity, at least for some while. She was interviewed by Bill Moyers and Charlie Rose, and she was, the cover of all kinds of magazines. There was something very charming about her. There was something quaint. She, as I said in the book, she was not someone out of central casting, you wouldn't think. She was this small, diminutive, figure with this sort of little hunched over, this black habit, protruding teeth, a little bit of a speech impediment, thick glasses. But once she spoke, you couldn't take your eyes off her. She would stand in front of a painting, some work of art, and the camera would go on, and without any script, without any rehearsals, just in one take, Sister Wendy, she would speak about what she saw in this painting. And she would take you on this amazing journey, into the heart of the artist and what he or she was saying in this painting or how she interpreted it. And it always was not just about what you saw in the painting there, but something deeper about the human condition. She really felt that this was, she said, the only apostolic work she had ever done, use to anybody else in the world, because she felt that in talking about art, she was teaching people how to see with the kind of eyes of the heart. And they might take that kind of contemplative way of seeing to all the other aspects of their lives. She said it was a way of talking about God to people who were not comfortable with that kind of language. That talking about beauty was an entry, was a path that led to the source of beauty, ultimate kind of reality. Well, when that kind of time of her life was over, I don't know whether it was failing ratings or just her own health or she'd had enough of it, she went back to living full time in her little trailer on the grounds of this Carmelite monastery. And where I come into the picture is a long time ago because I saw her on TV. We began to exchange some notes. I'm a publisher. I sent her books, which she enjoyed. I wrote books, which she was kind enough to endorse. She wrote books that I published. And so we had just exchanged business-like friendly correspondence. At one point in 2013, she said, I enjoy your letters, but if I'm to, devote myself to a life of silence, communication that doesn't have a real purpose doesn't really fit into that. I don't really have space for that. So I said, fine, fair enough. I wasn't trying to be buddies with Sister Wendy or anything. I respected her boundaries. I discovered as I got to know her later, that this call to solitude was not just a matter of vocation in the sort of religious sense, but it was a deep reflection of her temperament and her personality. All her life, she'd felt that she was a misfit, that she didn't fit in with other people, that she just wanted to be alone with God. I want to be alone. You don't get that reference. Anyway, when she joined this order at the age of 16, she had no comprehension of what the implications were of joining a teaching order. She thought, I'll be a nun, I'll get to pray all the time. That's not the way it was. And she was very miserable, really, but she felt it was the will of God that this was what she was called to do, until she had a kind of complete physical breakdown. And they finally said, okay, you can go do what you want. And she became this hermit. So she returned to the life of being a hermit. And this, she was, would never have maybe been heard from in the world again. 3 years after that little, gentle brush off that I had, I got a note from, she was now living inside the enclosure of the monastery because she was too old and frail to live by herself. And a sister would come in once a day and with a laptop computer and take dictation, and so help her with correspondence. And the sister wrote to me and said, we sent you an Easter card and it was returned because the address had changed. So I sent her my card and I said, by the way, we're publishing a book of writings of Vincent van Gogh. And she wrote back with great interest in that. I'm very interested in that. I want to hear more about it. We began exchanging some notes. Now, as you heard, I have a background in writing about Dorothy Day and about saints. So we had these topics of great mutual interest. But I assumed after one or two of these exchanges of letters, that would be the end of it. But they just kept happening. They kept coming. And before you knew it, this was a very major part of both of our lives. I mean, not in terms of the time, but existentially. Every morning I would wake up with this letter, as if I were getting a letter from Julian of Norwich in her anchorage or something like that. And it would go back and forth. And this became almost a daily thing for the next 2.5 years until she died in December of 2018. This book, what is it? It's very, I think it's entertaining, interesting about this relationship between two very dissimilar people. One, this, elderly and dying. She had a terminal lung condition. I didn't in the beginning expect that she would live very long at all, but lasted, a couple of years. Constantly having heart attacks, whatever. But this hermit, who had very strict kind of boundaries and had never let anybody really deeply intimately into her life, and didn't want to have special friends, didn't want to have special correspondence. That was not what she was all about. In fact, the irony is that when I finally got that Easter card that had gone astray in the mail, it was an Easter card. It was the words, it was a painting of Jesus and Mary Magdalene where he says, "Nola mi tangere," don't touch me. I thought that's the perfect message for Sister Wendy. I thought there's some little message she was sending there. Don't touch me, don't cling to me, whatever, don't hold on to me. Jesus is saying to Mary Magdalene. And that could have been Sister Wendy's motto. But something happened here, and I found some kind of key that opened up this interior castle that she lived in. And what you see is the development of this relationship that I can only describe as just love, a kind of maternal side to her that she had never allowed herself to experience. And the idea that this elderly hermit is experiencing this and discovering this kind of capacity for relationship and intimacy at the very end of her life, when she was already so immersed in the love of God, but maybe not so much in other kinds of love. At a certain point, I was urging her, I wish you would write more about your interior life or your story. And she said, oh, no one would be interested in that. That's rubbish. Completely uninterested in that kind of idea. She disdained, the whole idea of self-examination. She said, I know that's important to some people, but for me, I don't see the point. I just live completely in the presence of God. That's all that matters. But at a certain point, she actually said, it occurs to me that book you're talking about maybe could be cobbled together from some of these letters that we've been sharing, because they'd gone to such a deep place. It's hard for me even to, when I was reading through this book, it's hard to just read it, because you just stop on every page as almost a little mini retreat. The depth of her spirituality and of her thoughts on prayer and the church and Jesus and the cross and suffering and holiness and heaven and you name it, it is almost like a diamond. It's just so compressed. And from this lifetime of intensive, prayer and contemplation. But it's also charming, it's funny, it's hilarious. We share stories about our dreams. And what started with her, welcoming me to share some of my own life became reciprocated as she began to think about her own childhood, her own story, her own peculiar vocational, kind of journey that led from, began when she was 4 and was sitting under the table in the dining room and had this overwhelming sense of the presence of God, like a total blast of God's love, and knew at that point that that's all she wanted to do in life was to live for God alone. And then she had this sort of detour of being a teacher and all that kind of thing. But she said even the experience of the novitiate kind of was helpful, and she recognized that a certain selfishness she thought in herself. And she said the novitiate was very helpful for that. But it was also very humiliating in a lot of ways, because she felt that nobody could really understand her. She felt always like a misfit, like an ugly duckling kind of in this pond where she wasn't with her own kind. She thought that when she became a nun, all nuns would have the same experience. She didn't realize how exceptional her sensitivity to God was. It's sort of like having perfect pitch, or, seeing auras or something like that, until you discover that not everybody can do that, you realize how strange you are. And when she would talk about her feelings, her experience, even, the novice mistress or the prioress or whatever, they all looked at her like she was a kook or something. They didn't understand her at all. And I think that contributed to some of this privacy that she maintained. Somehow within our correspondence, she began to feel a trust and an ability to explore things that she hadn't before. And she reflected back to me, it was not all just one way, encouraging me to really think about my own life. Here's somebody who didn't believe in thinking about her own life, but she encouraged me to think about my life and to see the ways that God was present in my story, and not just in the moments of breakthrough or revelation, but of my own times of confusion and sorrow and failure and heartbreak. And we began to kind of share this together. I don't know exactly what else, how to introduce this book. It's hard to answer questions when people haven't read the book. But my hope is that and my experience so far is that people who read this don't just come away saying, wow, that was what a fascinating, beautiful story this was of the relationship of these two people. But so many people have said to me, reading this book, like, just triggered or opened up these doors of my own consciousness and memories of my own story. And to kind of, we both had become sensitized in our correspondence to these twists and turns in our stories, that in the ways that God was present in that story. We shared all kinds of things, dreams. There's a lot about dreams, my dreams, her dreams, about the people I met. She felt that she'd been living in this enclosed little cell. And she said, I feel like I've always had this, great love for God, but I tended to kind of blot out other people, blot out the rest of the world somehow. She was very charming, people enjoyed meeting her when she met people when she was traveling. but she always kind of kept it all at a distance. And she said that through what I brought to her as my kind of, as an editor, all the people I worked with, the people I'd known, the kind of books I worked on, and that sort of my engagement with social justice and peace and other social issues. She said she felt that I was bringing the whole kind of world into her cell, and that it was enlarging her. It's funny when you think that, like, you actually have a gift that you can give to somebody who's awesome like that. I mean, I felt that way with Dorothy Day when I knew when I was very young, and I was 19 when I first met her. Worked with her for 5 days, and many years later after she died, one of her friends said, you can't imagine what it meant to Dorothy when you became a Catholic. And I said, well, gosh, what I meant to Dorothy Day, it's just like incredible, the gift that this relationship was for me is one that is, that I will spend the rest of my life trying to think, what hit me here and how this miracle happened and why me, and how was I sort of gifted or chosen, privileged to be the recipient of this heart of this incredible mystic and spiritual genius, and I dare say a holy woman, who had so much to share. People know of her as I say, the art nun, but this is a side of her that she did not share. She felt that it was that it was just too intimate, for her to reveal to people, and she thought it was of nobody's interest. No one would be interested in it. But it's not just a back and forth of letters. There's a narrative arc to this. There's a story, as you see us both growing closer to one another, but also growing, in awareness and capacity to love, to understand things in a new way. Maybe that's a good place to begin that introduction, because we can go more deeply into some things in conversation. Is that right? Right.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for setting this up for us and giving us a little bit of background, because I think even those who may know something of Sister Wendy, they know from PBS or know from YouTube or something like that. And as you say, the book is truly incredible. I don't say that just because you're here, although it probably doesn't hurt. It'd be terrible hospitality if I said this book stinks. But the truth is, I think when folks think about a published correspondence, a collection of letters, it can seem sort of dry and historical and boring, but there is a real flow to this, as you say, a narrative arc, where we get to see you in greater detail, your life, your experience, but also get to see Sister Wendy and her sharing her questions. Where I'd like to begin is with something you mentioned in passing in your introduction, and you begin the book by talking about this or including Sister Wendy's quotation from her letter, and then in your epilogue, you're afterward, you come back to it, which is this line. She says, I quote, "I like communicating with you too, but if I'm to live a life of silence, communication without a real purpose has to be sacrificed." And that's like one of the best backward compliments ever. I really like, corresponding with you, but this isn't really that important. So what do you think accounts for her initial statement, and then the volume of letters? We were talking earlier, the original, the unedited copy is 350,000 words. And this is not even a tip of that iceberg. And so obviously something came around in her thinking about communication with a real purpose. How do you understand that? How do you think she meant that?
Well, I think in the beginning, she felt that we were talking about things that mattered, topics that were of extreme interest to her. The question of holiness, meaning of saints, She was very interested in my involvement with the story of legacy of Dorothy Day, my writings about saints. I'd written a book called The Saint's Guide to Happiness that she had endorsed. So she was very interested in the question of that we both shared, that the interest in saints is not just interest in these spiritual prodigies that we reverence or we revere, but that they teach us something about how to live and how to deal with, how to kind of metabolize ordinary life, suffering, work, in relationships, family, death, and to make of that the kind of the arena or the kind of fuel that drives us toward our goal or our purpose in life. So she felt that in a way she'd found a kind of comrade who shared, what she was really interested in. I'm sure there are people that she would exchange, thoughts about art about. I didn't really have a whole lot to say about that, but it turned out that this was this topic that, this is what she'd given her life to, and was of great interest to her. So there was a lot there of common interest. She was very fascinated by the series that I edited at Orbis called Modern Spiritual Masters. And when she saw the list of people who were in this series, she was kind of ravenous. And I began sending her all these books. And she was a voracious reader. She would read several books a day. She was extraordinary. And she would write back with these incredibly insightful, biting, kind of assessments of each person and what their strength was. This is somebody who has one song to sing, but it's a beautiful song. And, this person has many songs, but maybe not as profound or whatever, and she could really see, that, and she was a kind of connoisseur of holiness. So it began that way, but eventually it began to enlarge, into not just how we see God in the lives of the saints, but how we see God in ordinary life, in our own life stories, in our own relationships and where we've come from. And that began opening a door into things that she said, I'm thinking about this for the first time, she's saying, about her childhood. I haven't thought about this, or the remorse she felt about the way she treated her sister when they were little and things like that. And, as I found that at one point she said, I could write a book of reflections, maybe, if someone asked me good questions. So I said, well, I have lots of questions. Let's start here. What's a day in the life of a hermit look like? And what, did you ever attracted to Carmelite spirituality or what? I had these kind of questions like that. Now, I didn't mean it was going to be all like that. I thought we'd start there and we'd get into deeper things. And she said, oh, dear, those questions don't interest me at all. I think there's no point in that, Robert, but the fact later on, she said, I feel a little bad that I was so high hat about this. So here's some answers to your question. She began giving these amazing answers about what her life was like, how she had set up her kind of rule or discipline for her life as a hermit, and her relationship with the Carmelites, and went on all this kind of stuff. And I'd said, well, I really do wish you would write more about your kind of story, your inner life. No. But then, as I say, eventually she said, well, maybe you could cobble something together out of this book. Now, that I think at that point, maybe both we thought, we'll take out the highlights that have to do with the spiritual topics or something. Maybe there's a little book in there. I don't think she anticipated at that point that the correspondence, the relationship itself was the book, that we were writing a book together unawares. We weren't thinking about that as at that point, it had been just became a relationship. So I think that somehow this was not a violation in her mind of. Sometimes I'd say I'm sorry I'm imposing with you on all these, writing about my friends or about my children or some shit. No. This is a deeply spiritual letter you've sent me. She even said at one point, whenever you talk about your friends, I know you're going to be talking about God, because I did have this way. I'd talk about someone and I would size them up and the whole, what's the idea or the problem or the theme of their story and how they have dealt with these challenges or whatever. And in a way, it was the way I write about saints. It was really a subject of great interest to her. It was, she said, I I feel that I don't know myself very well, but I feel I'm very good at understanding other people, or at least understanding their holiness, which they might not know themselves, And I think that was a lot of what I felt that we were sharing, was about the ordinary sanctity of everyday life, and as reflected in people, in nature, in relationships, and in sorrow and suffering. And so ultimately, I did feel, at the end of the book, in my epilogue, I referred to a great conversation between Saint Augustine and his mother Monica, that he describes in the before Monica died, in the Confessions, where he describes they're actually talking about the happiness of the saints in heaven, and they go in this amazing kind of dialogue and conversation. And he said we just kept going higher and higher and higher until I felt like we could almost reach out and touch, ultimate truth. And then, of course, we, had to come down, and we found our own voices, and we come back down to earth, whatever. I felt there was something like that in this, that it started off in this narrow way of talking about saints and holiness, and then became, everything is holy. Everything has to do with sanctity and God's presence in our lives.
I'm tempted, as somebody who has written a book or two and sitting with a publisher, one of my publishers, full disclosure. One of the things that I found that really makes this book distinctive among published correspondence letters is an editorial decision that you made in the process that is absolutely significant in the best way, which is these little italicized sort of commentaries, sometimes even in the middle of a letter, that set up or summarize something, or provide some commentary along the way. And it allows for not just like watching a tennis match, right? As you're reading this book, it's not like Robert writes this, Sister Wendy writes that, Robert writes this, and then serves the ball back. But instead, there is a flow to it. How did you arrive at that, if I may ask? Like, it's unique.
I'm glad you appreciated that. I went through many, many drafts, mostly cutting it down, whatever. And that was actually the last thing that occurred to me. And I thought that it totally transformed the book, because I felt that it had the effect of making the reader a participant. So you're not just reading these letters, as you say, back and forth between me and Sister Wendy, but it's not as if I'm sort of breaking the fourth wall or something, talking to the audience, but sort of, it was a way of stepping back. So I'm not just responding to Sister Wendy, I'm kind of speaking to the reader, about how I'm reacting, for instance, to what something Sister Wendy said, or what it meant to me, or a concern. She said at one time there was going to be a break in our correspondence, I think, because Sister Leslie, our amanuensis, who took all the dictation, was going to be away for a week or so. Maybe you should spend this time, Robert, to think whether you really have the time for this correspondence. And I'm thinking, is she telling me that she doesn't have the time for this correspondence? And there's a gentle way of saying, back off or something like that. Or is she really worried about me? So I can say to the reader, I raised that question that I had, responding to that. Or when I was sharing some kind of personal detail about my life, and a little bit worried about what her reaction would be and how reassured I was, But in other times, it was just a matter of you needed information from my letter to set up her response, but my letter itself was not important. And I wrote to Sister Wendy about such and such, and then you understand what her response means. So it was a way of keeping things moving, and not getting bogged down in just the factuality of what he said, she said.
There are a number of really overt threads throughout the correspondence. One of them you've touched on, which is near and dear to your own work and life, which is saints and holiness. The contributions you've made in your books on the saints and your work on the saints really comes through, and it's clear how much Sister Wendy appreciates that. Another theme that you've touched on as well is the personal journeys, both a glimpse into Sister Wendy's prayer life, her personal life, her history, her sense of the world and experience, and yours. I've known you for a while, and I was learning lots of new things all of a sudden, which was really endearing. And another theme that is throughout, and maybe occasioned not only from your own personal experiences with some health issues that you've disclosed to Sister Wendy in real time, but also her own terminal illness and preparing for death, is that the themes of sickness, mortality, and suffering appear a lot. And so one question I had that I wanted to ask you is, are there things you learned about suffering or death from this exchange? Did you find Sister Wendy to be a kind of teacher in that aspect of your own life and reflection?
Well, I had, studied a lot of these kind of questions from my own reading of the saints and spirituality. I wrote a book about it, The Saint's Guide to Happiness, where I felt didn't come out of my own wisdom or anything, but out of my reflection on the saints, what they have to teach us about suffering, about death. But in a way, Sister Wendy would be saying, go back and read your own book. These things. That our happiness does not depend on outward circumstances. We know that both of us have experienced how new life, resurrection, can appear out of what seemed dead and a dead end. Things like that. And it was, of course, remarkable to see someone. Who she's, for instance, I wrote to her about a friend who was having difficulty. He said he's having heart problems, he's suffering a lot, and says, I don't find that I can pray. And she said, we can always pray. Prayer, people have this idea that you have to be on some high spiritual level in order to pray. God accepts accepts us in whatever state we are. And that's the prayer we bring, and if we're distracted, if we're angry, if we're depressed, if we're suffering, if we can't come up with words, God fills that space. And it was things like that it was just this kind of master class in classic Christian spirituality. The desert fathers, people would say, go to a monk or someone and say, give us a word or something like that. And maybe he would say some wise thing. But in every letter, Sister Wendy was bringing this to me, and not just the point of not just her own wisdom, but she was kind of taking all the daily drudge of my own life, which I offered up to her, and kind of just placing it on the altar of her heart, blessing it and returning it back to me. In which I could look around and say, she was constantly saying, do you have any idea how blessed you are? And she didn't mean just because happy things were happening in my life, but all of the ways that I could see great signs of grace in my life. And it was like this kind of spiritual magic mirror, back to me. So it, of course, it was very moving to witness her increasing fragility. The three parts of the book correspond to the 3 years of our correspondence. The first I called learning to see, the art of seeing, because this idea of seeing, contemplative kind of vision, the eyes of the heart, are so much a theme of what she brought to her contemplation or reflection on art, but also just her attitude toward life in general. The second chapter, the art of loving, and it reflected, I think, more the kind of relationship we were experiencing and the way that I saw this enlargement in her own attitudes. And then the third, the art of letting go, that has, it's both my letting go of her, but her kind of, I shared with her a story of a friend of mine who was dying of cancer, who said he'd had this deep kind of insight of like the image of an hourglass, like his time is running. We usually think of the sand, running down in the hourglass, but it's actually filling up in the bottom. It's not disappearing, it's a transferal, of everything that has been invested in a life is pouring out, but it's pouring somewhere. And that was, she liked that very much, but I think that was, she felt, that this temporal life was ending, but this was the opening to something that she'd look forward to all her life. And she said, when the last letter, when you hear that I'm gone, you'll know it's a time of the greatest joy for me. And I hope you'll rejoice for God's goodness in my life. And it was, of course, yes, I was sad when she died, but there was this wholeness and completeness. And I thought, like, well, we could have kept on exchanging letters forever. I would have enjoyed that. But everything had been said. There's nothing more we had to add.
Thank you. To change gears just a little bit, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Thomas Merton. So, there was, this is another theme that is consistent in the correspondence, the figure of Thomas Merton and Sister Wendy's initial skepticism, resistance, lack of appreciation. I don't know what you want to call it.
It's more ambivalence. It's more mixed feelings. She loved Thomas Merton. She was obsessed with Thomas Merton. I didn't bring him up all the time. She's always talking about Thomas Merton. He's always there. Should bring up Thomas Merton. And sometimes, but always, he delights me. He fascinates me. He drives me crazy. He disappoints me. He bothers me. And it was clear that there was something more to this when you have this kind of surfeit of emotion about some guy who's been dead for decades. What do you care? She kept coming back to him. And now here's this guy who was a monk, famous spiritual writer, became a hermit, not a hermit exactly like her. And she read everything that he wrote, even the really obscure kinds of things. She would read about him, and she would always have this undertone of disapproval, that she felt he was not a real contemplative. He was not a real monk. He was too inconsistent. She didn't like his uncharitable attitude toward his fellow monks and the abbot, and all the stuff that he wrote down in his journal. It's like that he shared it, everything, all of his missteps, his falling in love with the nurse, and all this kind of stuff. And I thought that maybe that, from her point of view, that would be the shocking thing, that he fell in love and everything. No, that was just she says, that was a midlife crisis or something like that. But she was other things that really bothered her. And I would, I've always, Thomas Merton, very important to me. I don't aspire to be a hermit or anything like that. But I always saw in Merton somebody, this kind of spiritual explorer, who didn't quite fit in the old mold of this ascetical kind of model of contemplative life, but was pointing towards something different. I think that's what Pope Francis recognized when he named him as one of the 4 great Americans. He said he was kind of a man always on the going toward the horizons, the borders, and dialogue. That's the thing that Sister Wendy didn't seem to like about him. Anyway, so we'd go back and forth. We even had some arguments about it, because I felt that she was really being unfair to him. That there was more to him than this way she was kind of assessing him. And so there's actually, if you're interested in this, you don't have to read the whole book. An America magazine ran a thread of this correspondence about Thomas Merton. In this toward the end of the second year of our correspondence, she has this total turnaround where she says, I feel I've totally misjudged Thomas Merton. He's much too large for me to appreciate. And I have to, in my humility, I have to say that reflects on me and my own narrowness and my smallness next to someone like that. She said there are many things that I think are wrong about him, but his wrongness is so connected to his rightness. He was a one-off kind of figure. Yes, he seemed to think that he had this big role in the world and social justice and peace and everything. Well, he did. He's right to think that. And I think she thought that the abbot, understood that he was a kind of unusual case and treated him with some wisdom and respect. She said that there's lots of muddle and confusion in his life, but it was the direction of his life. Under all of it, his deep desire for God was totally genuine. And that means that all the rest of it doesn't matter anymore. Well, you'd say, well, Sister Wendy changed her mind, except that Sister Wendy never changed her mind about anything. she said, what I have written. Everything was just one draft, one take, and she never changed a word or edited anything she'd written. And so there's a deep kind of conviction, and not just an opinion about is Citizen Kane the greatest movie ever made or something like that, something that she was obsessed by, kept coming back to. And you say, what's that all about? To me, this change I felt, and if you just read the exchange in America about Merton, you'd say, well, where does that come from? If you read the book, you have to see it in the context of this arc, of this narrative, of this change that was occurring in both of us through this relationship. And I think that caused her to open up and to let go of a lot of her rigid sort of ideas. The thing is, I don't think I'm really over dramatizing when I say that I compared it in the book to Thomas Merton's kind of moment of famous awakening on the corner of 4th and Walnut. Everybody knows the annals of Merton, how after being in the monastery for many years, he goes downtown Louisville and he says, on the corner of 4th and Walnut, I suddenly realized I loved all these people. They were, he before had sort of thought of the monastery as this perfect place, the center of the universe, and this escape from all the sin of the world and all the confusion and everything like that. And the monastery was kind of keeping the world going through this engine of prayer that was going on, self-sacrifice. He says it was like awakening from a dream of separateness, of this spurious kind of holiness and separation from the world. And after that, his whole direction of his writing changes completely. He says, it's like, it's now a whole new understanding that's not generated around this idea of asceticism, but is about humanism, and he becomes more compassionate and open to social justice and race issues and this kind of thing. Dan knows a lot more about that than I do, but who knows where Sister Wendy would have gone with this. But to me, it felt in a very similar way, that it was a waking from a dream of separateness, in which her special holy place in this hermitage was very disconnected from the rest of the world, and allowed her a certain amount of, I think, judgmentalism and rigidity in these kind of categories.
So with an eye toward time, I wanted to make sure there's opportunity for questions from the in-person and virtual audience. I'm just stating that for our introverts to start revving up your ideas and questions. I want to do a quick lightning round of naming some of my favorite scenes and stories, and maybe this will pique the interest for people who want to read the book in its entirety, or maybe some of the questions that you might want to ask. There are a lot of, when Robert was offering his introduction, you mentioned dreams a lot, but it wasn't just dreams like dreams and hopes, but literal dreams. You talk about some very interesting dreams. You have very vivid dreams, and Sister Wendy shares some as well. So that's something very interesting. I was really struck by, and I think, Robert, you are very humble and not name dropping as much as you really could, given that you've worked with some of the most significant spiritual, religious, and theological figures of the 20th century: Gustavo Gutierrez, James Cone. I mean, we could go on and on and on. And you share one line that really stayed with me from James Cone, when you, near the end of his life, were asking him about the Black Lives Matter protest, and you asked, have you joined the demonstrations in New York? Have you gone out and protested? Have you demonstrated? And his short response was, I demonstrate with my pen. More there. I was struck by Sister Wendy's strong position against U.S. Catholics becoming one issue people. Her sense of what was happening politically and in the church in the 2016, 2017, 2018 era. I love the game that you and Monica play in museums, art museums. So if people are interested, you can ask about that. I learned about the story of your solitary confinement in Colorado. I didn't know about that. And then one last fun thing I'll say before one real question, and then we'll open it to the floor, is in addition to the disagreement perhaps between you and Sister Wendy over Thomas Merton, I think a stronger disagreement the two of you had was over your admiration for Princess Diana, and Sister Wendy having no patience for her, whatever. I believe, if I paraphrase her response, it's using the language of my own mother growing up: if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all. That was kind of her response to you. This will be just a short question, and then from the floor and from the virtual audience, you've worked with so many authors over the years, including in the genre of memoir. You've worked with your father, Daniel Ellsberg. You've worked with Sister Helen Prejean on her relatively recent memoir. And Sister Wendy over and over again encourages you to write a memoir, or probably many volumes. Will we get to see yours someday?
That's a good question. It's funny that from the very beginning, she said it would, I'm glad you're working with your father on his memoir, but it would make me overjoyed, if I would leap, with Olympic heights or something, if you were to write your own autobiography. And I didn't know, where is that coming from exactly. It's not just that I've known a lot of interesting people and interesting experiences, but she really felt that I, what I shared with her, I had such a sense of how God was present in that story. And she felt that's exactly what people need to hear. It's not just because I thought, well, I don't write a book just to say, oh, I've had an interesting life, or I've known interesting people, or I had an interesting father, or something like that. But that there was a message there. She said, communicating the things that really matter. And she felt that she had nothing to say about herself, she thought. But she, at least looking at me, felt that there was something. So I don't know, who knows? We'll see.
Okay, we'll be waiting for it. In the meantime, Dr. Fetter has a microphone on the move. So if you just raise your hand here in the in-person audience and virtually use the Q&A button or the chat button, and Rebecca will make sure we pass that along.
Hi, Robert. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to read this book. I was struck by what you shared with us about how Sister Wendy understood herself as a misfit. And I think one reason this stuck out to me is I was thinking about Dorothy Day, who I also think is this sort of misfit figure. And so I'm wondering, in your experience with these women, in your study of the saints more broadly, is there something to this sort of misfit figure and great holiness or saintliness, or is there a special place in the communion of saints for these misfit women in your experience? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Really interesting question. I quoted to Sister Wendy a couple of times, my wonderful conclusion of George Eliot's book, Middlemarch, where she talks about her heroine, Dorothea, Brooke, and says that, that there is, who knows, how many Saint Teresas there are out there who, because of their circumstances when they lived, they always were just kind of a the misfit in this pond. There's a cygnet in a pond of ducks that never found its other oary-footed, foul friends or whatever like that. But this idea that so many people have a strong sense of vocation, and there doesn't seem to be any place for that. And now, in the case of women, I've written a whole book about women saints, and I'm so impressed by their stories, because in so many times they had to kind of invent a new way, because they were told, well, there's this way, there's like three different. You can get married, you can live in a convent, you can be a martyr or whatever. And they would say, well, I feel like I'm being called to something different. And there was always, some usually male authorities who would say, well, that's not God's will for you. That's not what God wants women to do, or something like that. And I think that Dorothy Day was certainly, like that, in the sense that she felt, this deep sense that she was being called to something. She was giving up so much in her life to become a Catholic, but for what? She's not going to become a nun. She's, a single mother and everything. And what was she going to do with all this her radical convictions, her commitment to the poor and everything? And she needed to this kind of find the spark, from Peter Moran that she met, kind of this kindling that was waiting there to come, to come alive. And in the case of Sister Wendy, I think that there were matters of not just a vocation but temperament, deeply. I mean, I think that I think it's fair to say that you would say that she was sort of on the autism spectrum, and from her earliest childhood, her descriptions of just not really relating to other people. She describes how once her mother invited a little child to come play at the house, and she said, okay, you'll sit there and read your book, and I'll sit here and read my book. And her mother said, that's not how you play. Well, how do you play? She had no idea about that. She spent the whole time when she went to Oxford, the superior of the community where she was living said, "Now you're not to talk to anybody. You're just supposed to go there and you come back." And the other sisters thought that was insane. But she went the whole time when she was in school without talking to a single other person. And that's the way she sort of liked it. There was this way in which she just felt that other people didn't understand her and she didn't quite really understand them. And somehow, though, she had found herself through this backdoor way to the place that was just right for her. And so that was an interesting, topic that we shared, reflecting lots of saints about how in vocation, finding the kind of match between what they felt called to do, but also who they were with a fit with, and when that happened, something, clicks and there's this incredible vitality and energy and aliveness that wasn't there before.
Thank you so much. I'm curious, at the beginning of your introduction, you said every time you read it, you learn something new, including the last 2 days. So I'd love to hear what new revelation on reading the book again came to you.
Well, again, it's a funny thing. I didn't exactly write this book. I received these letters, and often, I would receive them and I would read them. It would associate something for me, or I'd have some kind of response, and I'd respond to her without perhaps even, thinking about her letter very much. It was such a quick kind of. If these had been written letters, we would have had to wait for a week or so for a response, or by that time, the mood would have changed or whatever. There was this immediacy to it, and then after it was only after she died that I just went to the computer and began to read it all through again. And of course, there was a lot there that was not necessarily worth reading or interesting, but it took weeks to get through the whole thing, 350,000 words. And I began to see, there's really a lot in here, And so I edited. I went through many, many different drafts and taking out things and stuff. But still, there's a tendency to read too quickly. And sometimes, was when the kind of last draft, when as Dan mentioned, I began inserting some of these responses. It was almost, they were not necessarily responses I had at the time. It was more my reaction now to reading this again. But I can't point to a thing I just discovered, today in reading it or something. It's more a thing like, oh, wow, I hadn't really clicked with that. I hadn't really thought about that, so deeply. About what she had to say about the cross or suffering, or there's a amusing kind of, it's a little thing at the end. She was in her last months of her life. She suddenly had this idea that maybe she would write commentaries on these icons by Father Bill McNichols. Maybe people are familiar with his work. He's a mutual friend of ours, and she loved his work. But then she said, I like to do some reflections. But then she said, I don't know how to do that. I get too just swept away contemplating the mystery of the icon, and I can't write about it. And I said, well, that's fine but if maybe you don't have to comment on the icon, you just let's say an icon about John the Baptist, just what that suggests to you about his story and everything. And so she says, well, okay, I'll give that a try. And then she writes this amazing meditation on John the Baptist, where things that I had never thought of before, where when he says, behold the Lamb of God, and we think of the lamb as meekness and all this kind of stuff, but no, John the Baptist was seeing immediately that Jesus was going to die. He was seeing his passion right there from the beginning, and the fact that John the Baptist did not become a follower of Jesus, he was just the one who pointed to him, and his sense of his inadequacy or how small he was compared to Jesus, and seeing something that Jesus didn't see in himself, at that time. Anyway, these just kind of lightning flashes of insight that came to her, and the fact that she could bring lightning flashes to my describing a dream I had, or whatever, or a book I was working on, or something like that, or an argument that I had with somebody. What I saw outside my window was was, just still astonishing to me. I know I've reread this thing half a dozen times, even since it was published. And every time I just kind of takes my breath away.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed this so much. I remember Sister Wendy on TV, but I don't think that I knew anything about her. I don't think I know anything about her outside of what I've learned from you this evening. So I'm wondering, so I don't know this story, and I'd be so interested to hear it from you of how a person who sort of plays independently together and sometimes is so focused on God that the rest of the world gets blotted out. I love that image, although it is unfamiliar to me. How she, like, what is it about the visual arts that pierced that blotting, that sort of served as an icon for her? A sort of, how did she connect with art, and how did the BBC connect with her?
I think that was rather late in her life. I don't think it was something that was an interest of hers earlier. She was living in this caravan or trailer on the grounds of the monastery and contributing to the monastery. It'll pay her, help to provide for her keep by doing translations from Latin of medieval texts and things. And she began to get very worn out by doing this. And she asked the prioress, would you be all right if I spent some time just looking at books about painting? And they said, okay. And so she really was kind of self-educated about art. And she never thought of herself as a scholar about art. But I found that Sister Wendy, anything that she gazed on, she seemed to have this just amazing insight into the kind of inner depths. A little amusing sideline, just an example. She revealed to me that when she traveled, going to hotels and things, she liked to watch sports on TV. And she said, I like to watch horse racing in particular. They're not just the beauty of the horses, but I found that I had an incredible gift for being able to know which horse was going to win. And I probably could have made a lot of money on this. She said it was not so much that I knew which, like I could predict which horse was going to win, is I could tell which horse wanted to win. And usually that was the one that the one that wanted it the most would do it. So that was just one example of this, of somebody who was in so many ways, you see people, let's say on the spectrum like Greta Thunberg or something like that, who is very odd in a lot of other ways, and yet it's also a gift, I don't know, not in the sense of being a savant or something like that, but of looking at the world in a different way. And, there's various degrees of this or whatever, but there was something in Sister Wendy that could just, certain things that she didn't understand very well, I don't think, and other things that she could just enter into so deeply. And art became this, both a language for talking to other people about beauty. The love of beauty is just like the love of truth or the love of goodness is a way toward the kind of transcendental, deep, realities. And she felt that it was a way of talking about God, and it was a kind of language for her. I mean, she didn't listen to music. She said the music is too emotional. It sweeps you away. She never had been to a movie in her life. She went to a concert one time. And so when someone took her to the opera, and she said it was like almost too much. It was too overwhelming. Here's somebody who said that she couldn't share a cell with a cat because that would be, too emotionally demanding, on too much distraction from focus on God alone. But when she moved, they actually built a little building outhouse for her outside of her trailer just for all her art books, which got to be so, they're so voluminous, her whole library. And then she couldn't bring them all with her, but she moved into her cell there. And she didn't have even a window where she could see a little bit of sky, but she couldn't see anything else. She'd see a brick wall, and she was happy with that, because she said when she prayed she would pray at night. Like at first she was getting up at 11 o'clock or something. Then she said later, she said, I get up at 8 o'clock at night, to pray and pray the rest of the night. Like long before I go to bed, she's up. Her prayer day has already begun, and she would pray all night. She'd pray with her eyes closed. And what is this prayer? Well, just being present to God. And it was, I can't really relate to that, but whatever it was that happened in that experience of silence and prayer, of focus, concentration, it just sharpened somehow, this inner eye that she had. So, she's just, you read her commentaries on art, and maybe an art historian or would scoff at something she said or whatever. But you read it and she said, oh, and you think, gosh, I never would have seen that in a million years. Now that she brings out this drama that's going on in a picture of a bowl of fruit or something like that, that she can see so much of what this is saying. Cezanne was actually her favorite artist. So not just religious art, but anything that showed where, that an artist had put their soul into something, she could speak to that. But she said at one point, I don't have, trees and everything, but I have picture books, and art books that remind me of what a tree looks like. And I thought, oh, it sounded so sad. She didn't feel that was sad. She felt that her soul was filled with just, all of these images that she'd spent so much time contemplating and seeing.
Well, I think that may be a good place for us to wrap up. There's so much more. And the good news is, especially for those here with us, you can buy the book and read the more for yourself. But I know that Robert will be here as well to chat with folks in the atrium afterwards. Just a few notes of thanks. First to Dr. Julia Fetter, who is working at the Center for Spirituality this year with us as a project coordinator, and who has been our microphone in motion around the room. Thanks to Miss Rebecca Home and Miss Maria Dock, who are our student workers. Rebecca's up here making sure our tech is working swimmingly, and Maria will be editing this for posting later on. And a special thanks to Robert Ellsberg for taking the time to be here, for joining us on campus, for allowing us to enter into this relationship with you and Sister Wendy. There is no overstatement, I should say, in anything that has been said in this evening presentation. It really is compelling. It is a page turner that also at the same time paradoxically invites lots of reflection and deep consideration. So thank you for the work to make this possible and sharing this friendship, this relationship with us. So please join me in thanking Robert for his time here and for this.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.